Welcome to this session, students of Paul. I am just hooking up my microphone properly. There we are. And I want to talk about Paul's eschatological pagans. This is a phrase which has come up or will come up in the class. And I want to talk about what that means, Paul's eschatological pagans. It's a term that I first encountered in Paula Fredriksen in the book, Paul the Pagan's Apostle. And who are the eschatological pagans? What does this mean? And how does this fit into what we've been talking about as Paul's eschatological schema, the way he was thinking about the end of time, or society as we know it, and the inbreaking of Israel's God. So let's talk a little bit about Paul's opponents. And the reason it's important to talk about Paul's opponents is that Paul's opponents became an ongoing thing throughout Christian history, where people just read Paul's letters as if they were applying in their present day and applied Paul's language, often very angry language against others, to their own enemies. So Martin Luther, during the time of the Protestant Reformation, was applying it to his Roman Catholic opponents, calling them the kinds of things that Paul called his opponents in Galatians. And so this language has had an ongoing life in the reception of Paul. So if we put on our historian hats and we look back at Galatians and elsewhere, why is it hard to get an actual historical picture of who these people were that Paul was so angry with in his letters? Well, for one thing, we only have one side of the argument. We only have Paul's side of the argument. Secondly, we only have a piece of that much longer argument. We know that we do not have all of Paul's letters. So for instance, in 1 Corinthians, Paul writes, he says, in my previous letter to you, I wrote this. He writes, this is what we read in 1 Corinthians and 1 Corinthians. We don't have 0 Corinthians. We don't know where it is. We don't know what happened to it. Maybe someday people will find it, but for now there are missing letters. We know that we do not have all of Paul's letters. And finally, like any first century trained rhetorician, Paul used the art of persuasion. Besides structured argument, rhetoric included formal use of diatribes, angry, sarcastic rants, and prosopopoeia, creating an opponent in your own letter in order to discredit them. So you might say, and Paul uses these things not because he's sneaky in some way, but because everyone who was educated in the first century, as Paul was, used such language and such techniques. It was very normal. It was like our writing "Dear Sir" or "Dear Madam" at the beginning of a business letter or a business email, I guess. And so because there are formal ways in which you kind of set up an opponent who's not even necessarily real, and we still do this, by the way. So if I say, if I'm talking to the students and I say, there may be some who would ask me, why do we have to do the homework this week? Well, maybe no student has actually asked me that. I am just raising that imaginary interlocutor in order to answer the question. And Paul does the same thing. This is a standard of not only rhetorical argument, but human speech. But because of that, it makes it hard to know exactly who Paul's actual historical opponents were. How Paul's anti-opponent language became anti-Jewish slurs in Christian history. So this is important to know. In the traditional view of Paul, which has lasted for most of Christian history, Christians who forgot that, in fact, that Jesus was Jewish, Paul was Jewish, all of the early disciples were Jewish, and that non-Jews were very much an exception to the membership of the first Jesus assemblies. After Paul, the way his letters were brought into Christian tradition and into what became the Christian church, his intra-Jewish hostility against Judaizers. What does that mean? His angry comments about his competitors as Jesus missionaries became Christian anti-Semitism against Judaism, or anti-Judaism against Judaism. So Paul was very much, who Paul was angry at were other missionaries who had chosen other techniques and had made other decisions about what non-Jews should do when they came into the Jesus movement. So there were others who believed that non-Jews should convert fully to Judaism if they came into the Jesus movement. And Paul vociferously disagreed with that, angrily disagreed with that. But what happens is then Paul's letters, which are set in a very specific historic context, live on in Christianity. The cultural context shifts completely, and Christianity becomes a non-Jewish movement primarily. And all of a sudden, that argument between two groups within the Jewish Jesus movement all of a sudden becomes a Christian critique if it's taken uncritically, becomes a Christian critique against Judaism overall. And that's what happened in Christian history. We know that that's what happened. So sometimes it became one Christian groups against other Christian groups. Luther against the Catholics. You're legalistic, he wrote, just like the Jews. Luther was certainly he was a brilliant theologian, but he was awful in terms of Judaism and in terms of his attitudes towards the Jews of his day. Fredriksen writes, it was later intra-Christian diversity that kept the Jewish slur going. In other words, calling somebody, if you were a Christian, calling somebody you're like the Jews, or like using Paul's language, was very useful for arguments amongst Christians. It had very little to do with the Jews. The ongoing use of a polemical text. Both early rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity were children of first century Judaism. I've talked about this before, but just to repeat it. First century Judaism, late Second Temple Judaism, after the temple was destroyed in the year 70, very shortly after Paul's death, split in many different directions, I guess, but the two main surviving outgrowths of that were rabbinic Judaism, which became the Judaism of today that we know, and early Christianity, which became then the non-Jewish movement Christianity. Both were fighting for ownership, in quotation marks, of Jewish scriptures, of the Tanakh, or what Christians call the Old Testament, and for the name of the true Israel. So that's why Christianity became what we call supersessionist, and insisted that, in fact, the God of Israel's favor had moved away. This was the supersessionism, had moved away from Judaism and had been given to the people of Jesus, that is the Christians. So that's a supersessionist view. But all of this used Paul's texts, polemical texts, in new ways, adopting exactly the same polemics, but using them in new circumstances that Paul never imagined. Missionary religion or missionary religions. Fredriksen develops an argument against any idea that ancient Judaism was a missionary religion. She simply believes that there was no such thing in the ancient world as a missionary religion, not Judaism, not anything else. Now, she doesn't talk about this, by the way, but there were missionary philosophical groups. So in other words, in some ways you could, if you're an Epicurean or a Stoic or something else, maybe you tried to bring people into that. But religions were just went along with where you were and who you were. If you were Egyptian, you had Egyptian gods. And there was no idea that you converted to one true faith. You always acknowledged all of the gods everywhere in the world and worshipped your gods. First century Judaism really received some people as converts. So it did occasionally happen that people would become Jewish, but Judaism never solicited them until the Jesus movement, until Paul. And the only reason that Paul did it was not because of the message per se, but because of the eschatological time, because the time was short. He believed Jesus would soon be returning, and it was time to bring in the nations to witness the vindication of Israel at the hands of the Messiah and Israel's God. So why do we know this? The evidence of the oddity of Paul's movement confirms this. The early Christians were persecuted, not systematically, but were persecuted and treated with disdain because they were doing something that was unusual in the ancient world, and that was giving up their own gods. And this created all kinds of problems for them and for others. Why was the Jesus movement missionary? Well, Jesus was an urgent eschatological preacher. His resurrection seemed to confirm his preaching that the day of the Lord was about to arrive, and Jesus would be appearing as the Messiah, confirmed as the Messiah, and the Parousia with it. But the day of the Lord did not arrive, and neither did Jesus. So different answers. And so what happens is the New Testament, much of the New Testament, by the way, to my mind, is a reaction to the delay of Jesus' return. It's interesting. So many of the writings of the New Testament are really ways of trying to explain why Jesus isn't back yet. So Mark says the present evil generation has to end. John, the Gospel of John, the day is internal, and we live out the day of the Lord inside us and change. Luke, a rejection. Why is the day of the Lord delayed? Because there's going to be a rejection of Jerusalem and Judea. Luke is very supersessionist. The Gospel of Matthew, the message has to go out to the Jews of the diaspora all around the world before the day of the Lord can happen. They're all slightly different answers. Everybody's trying to understand why the Parousia has not yet happened. A timeline for the day of the Lord. Paul seems to have been part of a movement that believed that diaspora Jews had to receive the preaching before the day of the Lord could arrive. So in other words, when Jesus didn't return right away, there were a group amongst the Jesus followers in Jerusalem who believed that, the message has to go out to Jews spread throughout the Mediterranean and around the world. And once they know about it, then the day will come. But strangely, at that point, diaspora non-Jews started coming in and showing signs of faith. So the gifts of the Spirit, Paul says, or they showed belief. And Paul thought that this might be God's strategy. He eventually started thinking on his feet and thought perhaps this is God's strategy, that the non-Jews are coming in now. But the evidence of his letters seems to suggest that other Jesus followers and other missionaries disagreed with Paul about what it meant that non-Jews were starting to come into the movement. So the problem, part one, did pagans need to become Jews to follow Jesus? It's essentially that. This is the issue that Paul faced. Did pagans need to become Jews to follow Jesus, to benefit from the miracles of the dawning day of the Lord and not be condemned to its destruction of idolaters? Because in the day of the Lord, according to Hebrew scriptures, idolaters will be destroyed. So then, this is Paul. One of the first things Paul says to the pagan Jesus followers is, you must give up idolatry. Do pagans need to become Jews, though? Paul said no, and other Jesus followers said yes. And this is one of the biggest debates behind, for instance, Galatians. Do people need to be circumcised or not? Do men need to be circumcised if they start to follow Jesus? Paul says no. The problem, part two, could pagans continue their ancestral obligations of giving public displays of respect to their traditional gods, even while following Jesus? Remember, in the ancient world, it was not about belief. Religion, well, maybe belief was in there, but it wasn't primarily about belief. We tend to think of religion in terms of credos, subscribing to a creed and believing in something. But in the ancient world, it was about fulfilling the obligations. So you would give a sacrifice, you would give prayers, you would leave food, whatever it might be. Could pagans continue their ancestral obligations to their ancestral gods, their traditional gods, even while following Jesus? Diaspora Judaism had always said yes to God-fearers. They could come in and they could worship the God of Israel. They could take part in the synagogue services, and they could maintain their ancestral obligations. And some Jesus followers followed that and also said yes. But Paul says absolutely not. And what happened then? That produced, in Fredriksen's words, deviant pagans, neither fish nor fowl. They were no longer pagans in the same way. They were no longer worshiping their ancestral gods, which caused lots of problems at home for them and in their cities. But nor were they Jews. And so they were neither one nor the other. And this is where persecution begins. Conversion in the ancient world. There's no such thing as conversion in the modern sense, not even a word for it in antiquity. You were stuck with the gods of your birth. Anything else was treason. Think about a football team or a soccer team in Europe or around the world, or think about a political party. You're born into something and you're stuck with it, and people get angry with you if you change, or if you're not on board with whatever it is. But imagine that and then multiply it by 100 in the ancient world. In addition, everyone, including Jews, likely paid some form of respect to all gods. Fredriksen says at one point, by definition, a god is more powerful than any human, even a lower god. And so you pay respect to all gods. It was not safe not to. But you only worshipped one if you were Jewish. You only worshipped the God of Israel. Female non-Jews became Jewish through marriage. And so there was conversion sometimes through marriage, taking the gods of their husbands. And men sometimes, very rarely, converted to Judaism and were circumcised. Circumcision, together with the exclusive worship of Israel's God, became the clear marker between a sympathizer to Judaism, of whom there were many in the ancient world, and a full convert. The public test would be participation in the public worship of the city's gods, in which case, if you had become a Jew, if you were converted to Judaism, you would not take part fully in that. The problem faced by non-Jewish Jesus followers. For a pagan to sympathize with Jews was perhaps not all that unusual. We have lots of records of it in the ancient world and lots of inscriptions lots of lintel stones that show that non-Jews had given money to synagogues, for instance, or other things like that. But all pagans had inherited obligations to their own family, city, and God. So to circumcise meant to abandon all of that and to be unpatriotic and to risk disaster for everyone. If you were, say, a pagan from Ephesus, a regular person from Ephesus, a non-Jew from Ephesus, and you converted fully to Judaism, you risked disaster for everyone by you were forsaking the ancestral obligations that bound you to your city and held the fabric of society together. Now, there was some understanding that in some rare cases this happened, and Judaism was respected as an ancient and venerable religion. But Paul comes along and he preaches Jesus, the Christ, which was first just seen as part of Judaism and was part of Judaism. But the Jews in the synagogues would say, this is something new, this is something different. And so Paul's followers became exclusive followers of the God of Israel. Unlike earlier Jewish sympathizers, they became exclusive. They no longer paid attention to their ancestral gods. And according to Fredriksen, the belief in the ancient world was that spurned gods, like spurned humans, could be superhumanly mean and vindictive. And if you want proof of this, just read the Odyssey or the Iliad. And you see that there's a lot of cases where a god is not treated properly by their human. And what happens? Odysseus, wanders for 10 years because of a slight of to a god, or somebody dies on the battlefield because they didn't do something properly. This is the ancient world. It's not just in the Odyssey or the Iliad, but around the ancient world, this was the belief. You needed to very much pay attention to the obligations to your gods. And Paul's early non-Jewish Jesus followers stopped paying attention to their gods, and their fellow citizens noticed and were not happy. Paul upsets a delicate status quo by advocating that his Jesus followers exclusively committed to the God of Israel and give up their own ethnic gods, but insisting at the same time that they not convert to Judaism. He left them in a hostile no man's land and upset the balance that diaspora Judaism and its synagogues had in the wider world. So what happens? Paul and his followers were persecuted by fellow Jewish and Judaizing Jesus followers, by angry non-Jewish neighbors, and by upset diaspora synagogues, and by the gods that the pagans had given up. Everybody was upset with him. Paul upset the religious civic life of the neighborhoods in which his congregations took hold. This picture, by the way, is taken in Philippi. I was in Philippi wandering through the ruins and tried to find the prison of St. Paul, and it took me quite a while. There were no signs except this little tiny one on the gate that said that it might be there. All right. The essentialism of ethnicity and antiquity. So this is an important point. Some late Second Temple Jews, i.e. Ezra, Jubilees, and the Qumran community, extended the argument about Israelite priests to all Jews. What was that? That was, you cannot become a priest unless you're born into a family of priests. And some sources started to say that this was true of Judaism. In other words, a non-Jew can never become a Jew, even if circumcised. Not for everyone, but there was a stream in the ancient world of Judaism that said you can't convert. I mean, you can't change your spots and become a leopard. Just because you paint spots on doesn't mean you become a leopard. So you couldn't even convert to Judaism if you wanted to. It's a minority, perhaps, stream of ancient Judaism, but it was there. And Fredriksen thinks that Paul perhaps held this minority position. And that's why he is so angry about followers in Galatia who become circumcised. He says, you've messed things up. You're no longer one nor the other. And he says, if you become circumcised, you lose all possible status. Fredriksen uses the term ex-pagan Gentiles as a new category. Non-Jews changing something with regard to Judaism in the ancient world. It could be proselytes became a type of Jew through circumcision, if male. God-fearers who added the God of Israel to their own gods followed some aspects of Judaism. Starting with the Jesus movement in Paul, non-Jews who did not convert to Judaism, but gave up their own gods and followed the God of Israel and of Jesus without conversion. These were the ex-pagan Gentiles and the eschatological Gentiles that Fredriksen talks about. So that brings us to our final slide, eschatological Gentiles. Eschaton means the end. Apocalypse is a revelation. Some Tanakh or Hebrew scriptural traditions talk about the nations coming to Zion or joining Israel and worshiping God at the very end. It sort of says there's a vision of the end of the world, like Isaiah 55 or Isaiah 25, a vision of the end time. And it says the kings of the nations will come to Jerusalem bearing treasure, or sometimes be led as captives to Jerusalem bearing treasure. So there was an idea about eschatological nations turning to the God of Israel, joining with, but not joining, not becoming. They had to remain to the eschatological nations in order to show the vindication of Israel. In other words, if they became Jews, they were no longer witnessing the vindication of Judaism. You had to be external to that in order to witness to and to prove that finally Israel was vindicated by its God. So there was an eschatological inclusion of the nations, of the non-Jews, but not an eschatological conversion of the nations, or the non-Jews. And Fredriksen and I believe also that and I'm certainly happy to agree with somebody as accomplished and as well known in the field and accomplished as Paula Fredriksen, that in fact, this is where I've learned this from her and from Mark Manos and from the other texts that you've read, the other people that you've read, that at the end of time, some streams of Judaism believed that that the Gentiles would be included if they turned to the God of Israel, not by conversion, but turning to something slightly different and acting as witnesses to the vindication of Israel. So I believe that's it. And thank you for this being with me for this presentation. And I'll see you at the next one. Bye for now.